On a stormy night in a small rural town in Maine, a house is damaged by a tree that falls abruptly. The next morning, an illustrator examines the consequences of a strange electrical storm that occurred the night before. An old tree fell through his window, and his son Billy calls David and his wife to see that the lake house was also destroyed. The family sees a considerable amount of mist descending from the mountain, and David finds it strange, even after a strong electrical storm. David decides to go to the neighbor's yard to talk about the fallen tree. He cautiously approaches his neighbor, Norton, as they have had past disagreements. Norton is trying to get his chainsaw to work. David informs him about the tree and sees that the neighbor's car is also damaged. Norton then asks David for a favor, requesting that he go to town to buy materials for repairs. David agrees, thinking it might improve relations with his neighbor. David, his son, and Norton drive to town and encounter repair vehicles from an army convoy. Norton recognizes them as soldiers from a nearby military base working on the Arrowhead project. Norton asks David if he knows about the project, and David says that speculations range from crashed alien ships to supernatural creatures. They head to the store, and David talks to the employees Sally and Weeks, who are busy attending to many customers. Norton thanks David for his help, and Billy asks his father if he and Norton have reconciled. David says it's too early to tell, but for now, they are civilized. A group of soldiers enters the store, excited about leaving town for a short vacation. One of them shares a smile with Sally before greeting an older woman, Mrs. Irene Repler. The lady greets Billy and asks him how he dealt with the electrical storm before rambling about the storm and how it damaged an important part of the town. While Irene talks, David sees a woman, Amanda, who gives him a friendly look. Norton notices a military police officer enter the store and talk to the group of soldiers. Police and fire sirens are heard speeding through the town. Then, the military police officer orders the soldiers to cancel their vacations and return to the base as quickly as possible. Everyone in the store stops when the military base sirens sound. A man with a bleeding nose runs into the store, shouting that there are creatures in the mist that took one of his friends. Weeks tries to calm him, but he cries and tells them to close the store doors. One of the shoppers runs to reach his car, but the mist envelopes everything in front of him, and only his screams are heard. Everyone looks through the store window in silence, unable to see anything outside. When mysterious tremors shake the whole store, the manager tells everyone to stay where they are, but a woman insists she needs to go home to her children. Mrs. Carmody says the mist is death, it is a sign of the apocalypse. Later, David finds Mrs. Irene, and she introduces Amanda, who takes care of Billy, keeping him comfortable. Weeks, the store employee, tells David he can find blankets in the loading dock. David goes to the loading compartment and sees that the store generator is malfunctioning. He walks through the darkness and hears a noise coming from the back door of the store. The banging becomes louder, and David runs back to the store, scared. He finds Weeks and some others and calls them to check the generator. David tells them about the noise, and they all go to investigate. Jim, one of the men, hands out flashlights, and another store employee, Norm, joins them. They discover that something is blocking the generator's exit and plan to clear it from the outside. David objects, saying they don't know what's in the mist, but Jim and Norm want to proceed, saying they don't appreciate David talking down to them just because he's a famous illustrator. David defends himself, saying he's only concerned for everyone's safety, but Jim gets angry and threatens David. The rolling doors open, and Norm prepares to go out. The thick mist enters, and everyone mocks David for being afraid of the mist. Suddenly, a huge tentacle materializes from the mist and wraps around Norm's foot before pulling him. David tries to help Norm, but the rest of the men are paralyzed with fear and do nothing. More tentacles appear, and Weeks rushes to fetch an axe. The tentacles open, revealing claws and wounding Norm, tearing pieces of his flesh. Weeks prepares to cut the tentacle, but the young man is dragged away at that moment, causing him to miss the strike. Norm still manages to hold on, and David and Weeks try to pull him back. Jim and the other man are in shock, unable to help, as more tentacles appear. Weeks and David have no choice but to let go of Norm, who disappears into the mist screaming. Weeks hurries to close the doors while David tries to fight off the tentacles. He grabs the axe and cuts off one of the larger tentacles, severing the tip just as the door closes. David then attacks Jim, blaming him for Norm's death. Weeks separates the two men, and David continues to berate Jim for not helping. They reconvene inside the store and plan how to tell everyone. David starts by talking to Norton, but he doesn't believe them. So, David invites Norton to check the loading dock to see the tentacle in Norm's blood, but Norton becomes hostile, thinking the group would attack him for suing David. The rest of the people in the store hear the commotion, and David tells them what they experienced. As expected, no one believes them. Then, David takes the manager and another man to the loading dock, which is stained with blood, and they see the severed tentacle that soon evaporates in front of them. They return to confirm to everyone that what David said is true. Some of the shoppers help block the windows, but Norton is not convinced and believes the scene at the loading dock is an elaborate trick. He tries to convince some of the shoppers to go with him, while Mrs. Carmody tells everyone that what is happening was predicted in the Bible and that it is God's will. She keeps talking until she becomes the center of attention in the store and resorts to scaring the children, declaring that the mist demands a blood sacrifice. Weeks tries to defuse the situation by threatening Mrs. Carmody if she continues to scare people. Billy hears the soldiers discussing something, but David takes him away. Billy is scared, thinking about his mother, but David assures him that they will return to her. David talks to the others again, and some suggest making torches. Amanda reveals that she has a gun and hands it to Weeks, who has a lot of experience shooting. A commotion starts when Norton and a small group want to leave for the mist. David tries to convince them not to go, but Norton believes that leaving the store would be the best decision, thinking there is nothing dangerous in the mist. David asks one of the men to go out with a rope tied around his waist to retrieve a shotgun from one of the shoppers' cars. A motorcyclist volunteers and goes out with Norton's group. David holds the rope tied around the motorcyclist's waist until something starts pulling the rope. It takes 3 men to hold it completely, and when they manage to pull it, only the lower half of the motorcyclist appears. Myron and Jim adjust the lights and connect them to the batteries. The lights will illuminate the store in case of an emergency if something enters the store. Later, a huge flying creature appears in the store's window. Soon, more creatures appear, and David realizes that the lights are attracting them. Suddenly, huge flying beasts appear and start hunting the lower creatures. Jim and Myron hurry to turn off the lights, not knowing they are making the situation worse. The window shatters, and the creatures enter the store. David tries to light a mop, turning it into an improvised torch, to try to fend off the bizarre creatures. As more creatures enter, some people get injured and others are killed. The flying beasts are on fire, and David and the others manage to kill several of them using fire to their advantage. With Weeks' help, David saves his son, and Weeks kills the creature. Then the group of people manages to cover the hole in the window, and things calm down a bit. Someone says that Mrs. Carmody's premonition came true, as she predicted that the creatures would come for them. A moment later, David leaves his son with Amanda and goes to check on the others with Weeks. As he leaves, Amanda sees a woman who has taken all her sleeping pills to forget what she witnessed earlier. David meets with some of the survivors and discusses the possibility of leaving the store, saying that the store is not safe enough. David plans to go to the pharmacy next door to gather supplies for the injured before taking his car and getting as far away as they can. Some of the survivors agree with him, but Amanda fears that the mist covers a larger distance than David believes. He acknowledges this but is also concerned that Mrs. Carmody is slowly gaining followers with her religious delusions and how the situation could worsen the group's paranoia. Carmody keeps preaching that the mist demands sacrifices, and they fear that the rest of the people will start to believe her. Amanda says that everyone in the store is civilized and would never resort to such practices, but David points out that scared people get desperate in situations like this. Billy cries, fearing losing his father, but David promises to return. Carmody then stands in their way, saying that going to the pharmacy will cause the creatures to return, bringing with them the wrath of God. Soldier Wayne Jessup joins the group, leaving his other colleagues in the store. They venture into the mist and successfully reach the pharmacy. They scour the aisles for supplies and find enough medication for the wounded. Then, they see spider webs on the ceiling and find people wrapped in them. One of the people wrapped suddenly grabs Jim and reveals himself to be the military police officer. He starts apologizing, saying it was his fault, and then begins convulsing, his eyes turning white and spiders emerging from his face from the inside out. Shortly after, Jim encounters one of the creatures, a giant spider, and Weeks shoots, but more appear and start launching acid webs, one of which hits a man's leg and melts his skin. The military officer falls to the ground and explodes, releasing hundreds of spiders. The group is attacked but fights to withdraw from the location. Unfortunately, some group members are left behind. The people arrive at the supermarket screaming and frightened. David runs to Billy and hugs him tightly. The next day, David wakes up and sees Carmody preaching to a large group of survivors who listen intently. Weeks says that Carmody has become extremely convincing. The group treats her like a prophet, believing that what she says will come true, and Jim now seems to believe in her. David's group is still determined to leave and decides to talk to the soldiers, remembering the military police officer at the pharmacy who was apologizing, saying it was their fault. They find Wayne and ask what he knows about the mist. Wayne lies, saying he knows nothing, and the group notices that the other two soldiers are not there. The group decides to look for the men in the loading dock, but Jim sees them. Inside the place, they discover that the soldiers took their own lives. Wayne says that the soldiers must have hanged themselves after he told them what the military police officer had said. Jim emerges and drags him to the crowd, announcing that he heard confirmation that the mist is the military's fault due to a secret project. He admits he heard rumors that the military was experimenting with an interdimensional portal, and Carmody begins reciting how the project provoked God's wrath, calling Wayne a blasphemer. The crowd begins to assault Wayne, and one of the men starts stabbing him. Carmody then orders him to be fed to the beast, and the crowd drags him outside, applauding and shouting. Wayne begs them to let him go, but Jim throws him out, locking the entrance door. Within seconds, a huge crab-like creature appears and takes Wayne. Afterward, David consoles Billy, who tells him he will never leave him again and asks his father to protect him from the monsters. David promises that he will never let the monsters get him. The next day, the group prepares to leave, but Carmody is waiting for them at the door. She says they are blasphemers for disobeying, calling them sinners. Then, she tells everyone that David's group must be sacrificed to the mist and orders her followers to take Billy as the first sacrifice. David's group finds themselves surrounded and tries to fight back while Carmody screams and orders her followers to kill them. Weeks then appears and shoots Carmody. Without hesitation, Weeks finishes off the madwoman. Carmody's followers begin to retreat, allowing David's group to leave. The group reaches the door and starts running through the mist to find David's car. Weeks gets to the car first, but the giant crab takes him. The rest of the group is attacked one by giant spiders and separated. Amanda, David, Billy, Irene, and Dan reach the car, but the other two are not so lucky. David sees Weeks' gun and grabs it before starting the car. They pass in front of the store, and the remaining survivors see them leaving. They go to David's house, and David sees his wife wrapped in a spider web cocoon. He cries but decides to keep driving for Billy's safety and drives as far as he can. Along the way, he sees death and destruction everywhere. A huge giant beast full of tentacles passes in front of them, shaking the car with each massive step. They keep driving until they run out of fuel, and the car stops. David looks at the occupants of the car, hopeless and defeated, and realizes they all have one thing in mind. He grabs the gun and discovers there are 4 bullets left. Thinking they won't survive, David decides to use the 4 bullets on the 4 passengers. He begins to load the gun and fires several times inside the car. A few minutes later, we see David screaming for having killed the others, and then he tries to take his own life, but the bullets are gone. Frustrated, he decides to go out into the mist and screams and pounds the vehicle, wishing the creatures would come and get him. As he prepares to die, an armored tank appears. The mist slowly lifts, and a military convoy passes by him with survivors and heavily armed soldiers. David falls to his knees with desperate cries. The mist dissipates, and meanwhile, the soldiers with flamethrowers and rifles destroy the remaining creatures. The film ends with David lamenting that if he had waited just a few more minutes, everyone could have been saved.